And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hello again, this is Drew Perkins, and welcome back to the Teach Thought Podcast. I am your host, and I'm also the Director of Teach Thought Professional Development. As always, I'd like to invite you to visit our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, to check out our professional development services. All of our work is focused through the lens of inquiry, and project-based learning, differentiated instruction, and inquiry are the mainstays of the work that we do, but there you'll find some other pieces of work that we also engage in and help schools with. On the matter of project-based learning, I'm excited to let you know that registration is indeed open for our PBL Grow 23 event that has been on hiatus for a couple of years due to COVID. We'll be hosting that in our home base of Louisville, Kentucky, June 26th through 28th at a very cool venue. That event is meant to be an open registration workshop for individuals and small groups who are interested in learning more about project-based learning. So we use our Foundations of PBL workshop to help you understand and create a project for implementation with your classroom. School leaders, of course, would be creating a project that would be related to their work as school leaders. You can find more information about that at wegrowteachers.com/grow23. As always, we appreciate any shares, likes, reviews, and those kinds of things with regards to the podcast. It helps us build our audience and hopefully helps teachers and educators around the world better prepare students for the modern world. In this podcast, I spoke with David Bernstein, who's the founder and CEO of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and the author of a book called Woke Antisemitism: How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. We started our conversation by talking about the work and mission of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and then unpacked sort of the elevator pitch of the book. And then we spent most of the conversation diving into what we would say is woke and wokeism, some might call critical social justice, and some of my criticism or skepticism on the extent to which it has pervaded our schools, and looked at a few examples that he has shared with me and kind of dived into those, and other pieces around the ways in which this sort of orthodox and absolutism and dogma are problematic and threatening to some of the ideals of classic liberalism and the ways in which we need to be having conversations about uncomfortable things. As always, I hope this is a helpful conversation. David, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you on. And as usual, I want to give you an opportunity to say hello and introduce yourself so that folks know who the heck they are listening to.
Well, thank you, Drew. My name is David Bernstein. I am the founder of a group called the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and the author of the recently published Woke Antisemitism: How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. I've spent my life in the Jewish world doing advocacy work, mostly on the center left, even though I might sound like I have some kind of right-wing agenda. It's actually mostly on the center left on issues like criminal justice reform and immigrant rights and church-state separation and the like. And it was really about 2 years ago, I left my last job, which was the CEO of an umbrella organization that oversees Jewish advocacy at the local level. I left that job because, in part because it was becoming very ideologically unbearable for me. It was becoming extremely woke, not my organization itself, although there was some of that as well, but in the larger space, and it was sort of reflected what was going on in the larger society. That wasn't the form of liberalism that I signed up for. I signed up for liberalism that encouraged free discourse, that encouraged free thought, that deliberated over important issues and didn't try to short circuit the deliberative process over issues like anti-racism and so forth. And I signed up for a Jewish community that was focused on debate. I grew up debating. I raised my kids to debate, not in not in an argument, quarrelsome spirit, but in an open way that helped them develop critical thinking skills. So around my Shabbat dinner table on Friday night, I raise an issue for discussion, and sometimes they like the issue and they go along with it and argue with me, and I always took the opposite position, and sometimes they wouldn't. And they come up with their own issue and we debate that. And I think that really helped my kids develop the critical thinking skills that they're going to need in life. And that's what I was losing in my former job, and that's what I'm trying to get back in my current work.
Right. So you're the founder and CEO of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and as you mentioned, the author of Woke Antisemitism. I guess maybe can you unpack what and why maybe you have just a little bit there, but what and why the sort of impetus behind Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, maybe more so, like what is it that you are trying to do with that organization more specifically?
Sure. So what we're trying to do is restore open discourse and free thought in Jewish institutional life. We are trying to raise awareness among Jewish leaders and organizations that this ideology may be fanning the flames of anti-Semitism, and that it is certainly corrupting Jewish institutional cultures. We are also building bridges to other religious and ethnic communities that have a similar view on what's happening in the larger ideological discourse in society and want to push back against it. So we're doing a lot of work around that. We're specifically pushing back against radical ethnic studies, which is spreading around the United States, and teaching kids that America and Israel are settler colonialist states. But what I saw happening, and the reason why I moved in that direction, is that a series of sort of censorious interventions, cancel culture, you might call it. I'll give you an example of this. There were two Jewish demographers who wrote an article questioning the number of Jews of color in America. And there was a study that had come out recently by a group that I thought was quite politicized that said that there were 12 to 15% of American Jewish community was Jews of color. And their argument was that couldn't be. There was a Pew survey that had been out recently that found that there was something more like 6%. This was not in any stretch a radical position. They were just saying that the numbers were off and we should do more to be inclusive in our community, but those numbers aren't correct. And there was a firestorm, a cancellation campaign that came out that tried to really ruin these guys. There was a petition signed with 2,500 names on it. And the head of one of the major Jewish denominations accused them of white intellectualism, which I thought was astounding because I've never heard that term. And so I felt like things were out of hand. That was right before George Floyd. So it wasn't like the George Floyd murder unleashed all of this. A lot of it was building up to that point. And that was just a couple of weeks before. And so it confirmed in my own mind that this environment was inhospitable. It was anti-democratic, and that I needed to move on and do something about it.
Well, you and I have interacted a bit on Twitter, and I have not had the opportunity to read your book, but as we were talking before I hit record, I feel like I have at least read excerpts of it because I've heard you on several podcasts, and I think you make a compelling case, but you and I have exchanged a few tweets as I kind of try to be skeptical and cynical about some of the sort of claims of, let's brand it CRT or wokeism, whatever you want to call it, sort of being so pervasive in all of our education and other institutions as well, but especially K-12 and university. And so, I guess that is something that I think we want to talk about here. But maybe, the elevator pitch or an unpacking of the book so that folks have an idea of what your argument there is about, how this progressive ideology is actually harming Jewish people.
Yeah. So it's an ideology that holds in a very rigid way who the oppressors are and who the oppressed is. It's a binary. So if you're white, you're an oppressor. If you're male, you're an oppressor. If you're a person of color, you're oppressed. If you're female, you're oppressed. so on and so forth. It's sort of it espouses a very rigid hierarchy of privilege, who has it and who doesn't by virtue of their identity. And whenever you attach identity to privilege or oppression, it's going to be very easy to attach Jewish identity to privilege and oppression. So Jews will be, by virtue of their average success in society, are always going to be viewed as part of the oppressor class, which already fits into an anti-Semitic narrative that Jews are sort of, running things and are in charge secretly of all these institutions, of banking, of media, of Hollywood, and the like. And I'm saying we're sort of setting ourselves up, because some Jewish organizations buy into this, into an ideology that's going to hold us in contempt. This ideology views success as oppression. In other words, groups that succeed on average are viewed as either part of the oppressive class, complicit in oppression, adjacent to oppression, taking advantage of the oppression that's taking place against others. That's what the sort of equity framework lays out by Ibram X. Kendi. He believes that that any disparity among groups in any institution society is a sign that the groups that are on average doing less well are automatically being discriminated against. But that also must mean that the groups that are doing better than average are doing the discriminating too. How else are the people being discriminated against? And so I think that actually sets Jews up to be the oppressors. Jews are also very often viewed as white. Now, I don't know what white and black actually mean. To me, these are social constructs. I mean, but and pigment really probably matters close to zero. The Nazis looked at Jews and didn't see white people. They saw a race that they wanted to exterminate. And it's never been part of my identity to be a white person. I don't care. I have no problem if other people view themselves that way, but I've always viewed myself as just sort of Jewish or ethnically amorphous. My mom is from Baghdad, Iraq. According to 23andMe, I'm 50.3% Western Asian. She's a Jew from Iraq. And, I've never really liked checking the white box on the census form. But what this ideology insists on is that Jews are white and therefore have to shed their complicity in white supremacy because they've taken advantage of their whiteness. And I think that's also very dangerous. We don't have to let others define who we are by race. As one of my colleagues, Pamela Peresky, put it, when whiteness was considered a moral good, Jews weren't white. When whiteness is considered an unmitigated moral evil, Jews are then deemed white. And so I would prefer not to identify along racial lines at all, but that's sort of what this discourse is insisting that we do, that we've taken advantage of our whiteness, so therefore we must be oppressors, and therefore we must now ally with these ideological forces to overthrow the white supremacy culture. So again, I think this discourse is dogmatic, and dogma always begets more and crazier forms of dogma. And so it's a conspiracy theory, and anti-Semitism tends to be embedded in other conspiracy theories. So I'm very worried that as this ideology continues to spread in institutional life, Jews are going to really feel the effects of that, and I think we already have.
Well, that all makes sense to me, and I have some of those same concerns as well. One of the I think probably the previously published podcast, I spoke with Dr. Tabia Lee, and I know you're familiar with her, and she's experienced some of these things and this sort of absolutism and this dogma and this orthodoxy and the unwillingness to allow sort of differing opinions or even questions. And she'd even been, I think, challenged. I think she mentioned in that podcast, and you're probably more aware of it than I am, of how she was advocating for sort of Holocaust history kind of things, and was told something along the lines of what you're saying is like, we shouldn't be studying this, they're oppressors or something like that. And I see some of the same things. I'm sure you're aware of like Latinos being branded, like sometimes they're white and sometimes they're not white when it's convenient to one argument or the other. And it is really strange, and it really is really bizarre. And I try to be skeptical of these claims of somebody like a Chris Rufo, who's, I think, illiberal and obviously he's an activist. He says he's an activist, right? So making this case that is so widespread and it's in every corner and it's such a problem that we have to stamp it out and do anything we can to stamp it out, even if it's being orthodox and dogmatic in itself, right? But I think that, or I'm wondering if it makes sense to you. I think we may have even exchanged some tweets about this. The idea of woke, right, which has become a pejorative, it has become a word that is just almost meaningless at this point. But to help with that, like, is there a distinction that makes sense, or does it make sense to distinguish between sort of new woke and classic woke, right? So classic woke to me would be something that would be consistent with like Martin Luther King Jr. And open to question and pluralistic in ideologies and thinking and that kind of thing. Whereas the new woke, which isn't limited to race, it certainly isn't. And I think wokeism, classic woke, probably is more limited to race. And I mean, it's culturally rooted in African American, sort of that movement. But new woke is, we see it in sort of trans ideology and gender ideology, is like, this is the accepted and only story, and any differing from that, any veering off of that path means you are a moral monster. And again, there's some sliding scale here, I think, of this rigidity, but does that distinction make any sense to you? Or have any use?
I'm not sure that Martin Luther King or even that civil rights vibe from the 1960s in any way what I consider woke. Look, I know that these terms are subject to interpretation, and we can find ourselves in a kind of semantic chaos around these things. By the way, same thing happened to fascism, the word fascism and socialism and the like. People start using those terms, and before you know it, they mean different things to different people, and they start to lose their utility. What I mean by woke, and there's not a better word for it yet, and when there is a better word for it, you can count me in, is two things. One is that the first tenet is that racism and bias and oppression are not just a matter of one's individual attitude, but are embedded in the very systems and structures of society, in the air that we breathe. And the second is that only those with the lived experience of that oppression are really qualified to define it for the rest of society. Only they have the authority to speak on their experience and what that racism feels like, looks like, and it manifests. Now, both of those things can be true. It can be true that oppression is embedded in the very structures of society, but it's not always the case. That's just because there was Jim Crow in America doesn't mean today's America is Jim Crow.
Right.
I know some people feel it is, but I think that that's highly suspect, and I would challenge that.
Or Jim Eagle.
Or Jim Eagle, right. Secondly, while it can be true that people who have experienced oppression have something that we should all listen to or hear, doesn't mean that they have unqualified expertise, doesn't give them a monopoly on wisdom. As a Jew has experienced anti-Semitism, I think I have something to say, and you should hear me out. But, there are other Jews out there who might have experienced it differently or have a different interpretation, and you should listen to them too. And also there may be other data points besides my lived experience that you should listen to, such as the Pew study that found that American Jews were the most admired religious community in America. So I think that this it's not that these ideas that come out of this rigid dogma don't have some usefulness at times.
Right.
Like even the idea of intersectionality may have utility in certain, it's a heuristic that has utility under certain circumstances, but they're not always true. They're not axioms, and they're treated like axioms. Jonathan Haidt likes to say that critical race theory is cuckoo. And by cuckoo, he doesn't mean crazy. He means it's like the cuckoo bird that goes in another bird's nest and kicks out all its eggs. And I think that's really what you're dealing with. It's not that, I have no problem with the critical theory lens of looking at systems of oppression. What I do have a problem with is insisting that that's always true and that you can't challenge it.
Right.
Going back to your thought that, that this is not everywhere. I mean, I think that maybe I'm somewhere in between what you asserted and where Chris Rufo is on that. I think it's in a lot of places. I think it's in a lot of schools. My kids right now are are going to be learning about, and some kids already are in my kids' school system, white supremacy culture. That's Tima Okun's idea that that our very culture in America is by nature white supremacist. It has norms and values that are associated with whiteness. And so therefore, cultural attributes like being on time, promptness, is a white supremacy value that should be rooted out of our culture because it's a way of maintaining control over people and oppressing them. And I think that's absurd. And even if you do teach my kid that, and I'm okay with that, as long as you teach an opposing view. And of course, there's no opposing view. These things are presented as absolute facts. They're first presented to teachers as absolute facts, and then they're presented to students as absolute facts. It's completely inimical to critical thinking. And I think, and by the way, I wrote an article about this last week about what I saw and how this white supremacy cultural framework was being used. And, it's in schools all over the country. It's in New York City schools. I got emails from somebody from, the Boston area who showed me the PowerPoints that they had gotten. The National Education Association talks about the importance of that framework, white supremacy cultural framework. So I think it's in a lot of places, and I think it's in the ideology has infected a lot of institutions. That doesn't mean that everybody in society holds those views. Far from it. But right. I think certain institutions are very susceptible to sort of deferring to these ideologies, and I think that's exactly what's happened.
Yeah, well, honestly, I'm becoming more convinced of it, and I have real concerns about even where I do see it, because I do agree with you that there's this mindset that is authoritarian, saying this is the way to think, and anything else is a problem, your problem, and that everything goes downstream of that. But like you mentioned, so New York, Boston, Seattle, California with Dr. Lee, but here in Kentucky, I think you're likely to see it in Louisville, Lexington,
right,
those demographics that are consistent with bigger cities. But in rural Kentucky, you go to Western Kentucky, I don't think you're likely to see, especially not the versions that you're seeing, right? I mean, and you sent me a couple slides shows, and they are concerning. And I've seen those. The internet is great for seeing those, but I would acknowledge that there are teachers who, even in those rural areas, who, again, I mentioned this sort of sliding scale before, of like, they're not particularly steeped in any ideology. Like, they don't really think about it a whole lot. It's not a big piece of their life, like it is on Twitter and mainstream media. But they might have, especially maybe the younger ones, might have sort of tinges of, well, that seems right, because it is intuitively right to be, I want to be anti-racist, right? I mean, that's one of the semantic games that term in particular uses. And so I do think you might see some of it in sort of filtered, very minor ways. But I also, and I've made this point before, and I've seen it before, in rural Kentucky, you might see versions of it that are more related to, let's say, the proselytizing, evangelistic nature of Christianity, right? And, I can recall back when I was teaching, this was a number of years ago, you can look it up, it was a CNN, there were helicopters flying over. One of our students was a couple of our students were Muslim, was a Muslim family. One of them in particular had asked for some sort of non-denominational prayer, and that just, set off a firestorm. And out in front of our high school were, a few people who they said they were with the local KKK and protesting, and so you do see, and I've seen some evidence of that, and it's every bit as troubling, as dangerous there. So sure. So I don't know. I mean, there's not really a question there.
I agree with you on the rural-urban split around this, or maybe the urban-suburban rural split around this. And I think, obviously, certain states you're more likely to deal with this. I live in a blue state. I live in Maryland. So it's quite pervasive. Now, there are probably parts of Maryland where it's less likely to occur. Now, again, I'm not so. So if I overstated in that sense, you're right. But I do think that it's in a lot of places that are either blue state or purple state.
Mm-hmm.
You see this in Virginia, and I think one of the reasons why you see certain flashpoints like Loudoun County, Virginia, is because they're really split down the middle politically.
Yeah.
So the bureaucratic class can't get its way, or doesn't have a free ride, a cakewalk, and faces parental opposition. Whereas when you get into Montgomery County, Maryland, where I live, it's so blue that the people who do oppose it, and there are people who oppose it, are quiet and scared and don't want to raise concerns and the like. And so I think that's where how the dynamics vary geographically and politically. But I'm concerned about institutional life more generally. I'm concerned about about medicine, and I'm concerned about the legal field, and I'm concerned about the arts. I mean, imagine in theater or in drama in general, you can't write parts of another ethnicity or another gender.
Right.
I mean, it's just devastating for the arts, and I think that so I think that this is sort of it's created an alternative operating system in society. If liberalism is the fundamental operating system of our society, that is the ability to have free exchange of ideas, arguments, and that we try to come to the truth through that. And it's not perfect; it doesn't always work perfectly by any stretch. If that's being trumped by what's sometimes called the successor ideology, that only the people with lived experience of oppression get to determine what's true for the rest of society, I think we're really in dangerous territory, and I think it's too pervasive to downplay. Now, does that mean that the Chris Rufos or the Ron DeSantises are right? And here's my thing: like what my brain wants to do with them is not to take them as a package deal. Certainly not DeSantis. When I look at DeSantis, do I want the state of Florida or any state to ban the teaching of divisive ideas or whatever they're called? No, I do not want anybody to ban anything. I think that's an affront to freedom of expression and speech, and probably unconstitutional. Do I think that DEI bureaucracies and universities are problematic? Yes, I do, and I think that they're very stifling. If you could, when we're thinking about DeSantis or Chris Rufo or whoever else as engaging in censorship, look, the other half of that equation is indoctrination in these institutions. And if you ask me what's worse, censorship or indoctrination, I think indoctrination is worse than censorship. In other words, if I had a choice for my kid to either learn about either not learn about Ibram X. Kendi's anti-racism book or be indoctrinated in it, I'd rather not learn about something than be indoctrinated in it. Now, that doesn't excuse overreach on the part of the people like DeSantis and Rufo who are trying to, extract any teaching of it or any discussion of these things. I think that's overreach. But I think we ought to deal with these things one at a time and discuss them more rationally than we do, because it's easy to look at them as a package deal that we either entirely support because they're finally taking on wokeism, or they're fascists who are trying to destroy society and censor every book. And I think neither of those things are exactly true, and I think a more nuanced conversation is in order.
Right, which is what the world seems to love right now, nuance and complexity.
Right.
Yeah, so... And again, I don't disagree with anything that you say there, and I guess my question is, and if you have the answer, then you're going to be a wealthy man, and I don't know, but I am continually trying to explore how do we help people, and especially schools, because that's the area in which I work, navigate this. I mean, I know here in Kentucky, which is a pretty red state, we have, bigger cities, and it's a bit schizophrenic in that we tend to elect Democratic governors and Republican legislatures. It's very odd. But that being said, fairly recently, our Department of Education Commissioner, Jason Glass, who's been on the podcast, and I know he was, publicly berated as something, overly woke or a woke warrior or something like that. And to the extent that I know Jason and the folks at the Department of Education, and I do know some of them, I would not define them as overly woke. Certainly, I would probably put them in the similar kind of liberal, basket that you and I are agreeing on. And so it becomes, as you mentioned, sort of this binary, right? It's like this you're either with us or against us, and that's the example of the right using that cudgel and using that that orthodoxy and dogmatic. So I guess one of my questions is, and again, you'll be a wealthy man if you can answer it, is how should we help schools, and perhaps more K-12, but not necessarily K-12. I know Heterodox Academy is dealing with higher ed, but they've stepped out of the K-12 space. And this is something that I am interested in, we've been talking about, and I've had people approach me, is like, how do we help school leaders across our country navigate this in a way that is consistent with, sort of Jonathan Rauch's liberal science, classic liberalism, pluralistic ideologies, and all of that?
Yeah, so I would say that first we've got to really develop the alternatives. I mean, they're there in a way, but we perhaps always taught them to a degree. But for example, the antidote to liberated ethnic studies, which is teaching kids exactly what they have to think about power and who has it and who doesn't, and that America's a colonialist state and the like. The antidote to that is not don't teach diversity at all, but rather constructive ethnic studies. Let's teach a version of ethnic studies that educates kids about the various ethnicities in our larger culture, in our larger society, and let them understand where they came from, under what conditions, and so forth. There's ways of doing that are liberal in nature, that allow for open discourse, that don't indoctrinate kids, and so I think we've got to fully develop those into education modules that a teacher or principal could use. And I think that's we're behind, because these radical forces sort of seized the day after George Floyd and started instituting their curricula in various places, and selling them to various school districts, and we're caught a little flat-footed now trying to catch up and develop all these new approaches, or not so new approaches, to teaching about ethnicity and so forth. So I think that's number one. Number two is that we've got to change the political dynamic in a way, or institutional dynamic. We need more people to come out in a constructive way. I'm not talking about the people who go and start screaming at teachers and send them threatening emails and so forth. I'm talking about bringing more constructive, moderate voices into the mix. These are the soccer moms and soccer dads and everybody else who just wants their kid to learn the math, English, and also be able to discuss and debate various concepts. I think that that's the majority, and we have to sort of create what I call spirals of courage. There's this concept of the spirals of silence, that a small minority of people can sort of shut down the majority and look like they actually represent more than they do.
Right.
The spiral of courage is to get people to start speaking out thoughtfully, maybe, and sometimes getting critical mass among themselves. So you have to coordinate in advance and say, okay, now instead of showing up by yourself at the school board meeting and being shouted down, coming to the school board meeting with 20 other people who are ready to challenge what's happening, or go to the principal with 5 other people and challenge what's happening. I think we've got to do, the moderates have to organize. The moderates can have to stop worrying about being yelled at by one side or the other. They've got to organize. There's this old phrase that I like: never wrestle with a pig, because you'll get dirty and the pig likes it. And the problem is that that's sort of the moderate watchword in a way. And when you constantly tell yourself that, don't wrestle with a pig because you'll get dirty, even if you don't actually say it in those words, the pig eventually wins, because you never wrestle with the pig. The pig slowly gains ground to the point where the pig is in charge. And I don't want to call anybody a pig. I'm not. But
you're canceled for that.
I'm canceled for that. Exactly. I'm just saying that eventually that the authoritarian wins, and all of a sudden you're like, what happened? Why did the authoritarian gain so much power? Because the moderates never at any point wanted to get dirty in that fight. I think people have to get a little bit dirty. They don't. That doesn't mean they have to become radicals and yell at anybody. They just have to be willing to speak up firmly, and organize. And I think that's a predecessor to to being able to bring in new curricula and more constructive ways of educating our kids.
Yeah, well, it really is sort of the problem of centrism or moderate positioning, right? My mom would say, "Don't get in a pissing match with a skunk," and we do. I think that courage is, like I have tried to model those conversations here on the podcast, in some ways on Twitter and Facebook, and I've mentioned this before, but I find it entertaining in some sense but frustrating in the other, is that depending on who I'm talking with, I'm either some sort of right-wing Fox News loving kind of ideologue, or I'm the liberal friend with these sort of left-wing values that, again, is that we have so many people that seem to have been fooled into this idea that we have to play team ball, right? That it's my team versus your team, and we're looking for, are you on my team or are you the enemy? And if you're the enemy, I have to attack you. And moderates would, we're looking for the best and perhaps the worst of either argument so that we can distinguish and say, here's the path forward. But that does take some courage, right? Because you are likely to get pushback. You might even be called names. And, it is a real challenge insofar as how do you mobilize, because you're sort of mobilizing around something that isn't really all that great a source of passion, right? That's the thing, is that people get passionate about religion or anti-racism or whatever, but we're just passionate about liberalism, and that doesn't by definition have sort of an orthodoxy, I suppose, right?
Yeah, no, it doesn't, and that's why. We all know that it's very hard to mobilize, even before wokeism and whatever else we're dealing with out there. There's always been the quandary of the moderate. How did these moderate get organized and get passionate? They vote, by the way. Moderates often vote, so you see it in the polls and you see who's elected very often. So that's where you see the disconnect between what appears to be the status quo or the very divisive political culture, and then, of course, somebody votes and they vote in a moderate, and it shows that people really don't like these ideological polls. One of the other things that I've noticed, I've spent some time in Canada and dealing with the situation in Canada. In Canada, they tend to wokeism tends to sort of spread like wildfire, and there is no Chris Rufo in Canada. There's no Ron DeSantis in Canada. There's no opposing political force to stop its spread, and that challenges my way of thinking about the Chris Rufos of the world. I worry, as somebody put it recently, that if Rufo wins up, we'll end up with a Mike Pence kindergarten curriculum down the line. And so I worry about that the alternative will not be liberalism or restoration of liberalism. It'll be something that I actually object to just as much, if not more, than the white supremacy curriculum that my school kids are going to be learning. But that said, I also worry that if there's no opposing political force, even one that I don't particularly like that much, then there will be nothing that stops them. That the ideologues and the bureaucrats and others who are pushing for this will not have to pause. They will not have to pause and say, "Wow, if I do this, X will happen." And so I'm trying to figure out in my own mind, can I make peace with those political forces and triangulate in the end, knowing that I don't, and my hope, and I don't have any reason to believe that I'll be successful or fail, is that society can find sort of an equilibrium that more or less reflects liberalism, that in the end of the day we'll say, well, listen, we're not going to teach that America is a white supremacy culture. But we're also not going to teach the Mike Pence curriculum. So let's start debating these ideas in a more open way. Let's have real rich discussions. Let's teach critical thinking skills. Like maybe that will be the compromise position that comes out whenever at the end of the day, whenever the end of the day is.
Yeah, I think you're hinting at one of the things that Jonah Goldberg, who's associated with the Dispatch, and he makes the point, and I think he's right, is that we really have two very weak political parties right now, or not healthy, and I don't think anybody who's a moderate would say that either of them are healthy, and we need two to be, at least two, and there's an argument to be made for more parties and Forward Party and different parties, all that, right? But at least, because when one is compromised and unhealthy and the other is strong and taking these authoritarian moves, making these authoritarian moves, you're going to see the Mike Pence second grade or the opposite, version of that. And so we have to sort of rebuild our political system and parties and disincentivize the capital, the social capital that comes with being on one of those teams. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening anytime soon. It seems to be getting worse and worse because the cable news and social media and the internet is making that, it's amplifying all of those voices, as you mentioned, that are the smaller voices. And like Trump would not, I don't think, have been able to capture the imagination of the right without cable news. I mean, Fox News being the obvious Dominion stuff, right? And so he's a creature of that mechanism and those devices. So with knowing that we're not going to get rid of those, and I'm not in favor of banning cable news. I just wish people would stop watching it and paying attention to it, because it's like junk food. It's like eating McDonald's, empty calories, right? And worse, it just makes you angry. They're stoking the grievance. So getting back to the idea of teaching, and you talk about critical thinking, and so how do you, and you and I were talking before we hit record, and you're talking about project-based learning, and you're an advocate for that. Obviously I am as well, and I think project-based learning would be a great way, and certainly inquiry, because that's the heart of it, to help students think about these issues, number one, but sort of a double, sort of the parallel of building those civic skills that hopefully would result in adults down the line of saying, all right, here's how we allow for these other opinions and this sort of pluralistic, this sort of application of liberal science. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts about thinking about the project-based learning and inquiry and teaching that? So you shared with me two different slide decks, but those are with teachers, right? Those were meant to be
teachers, but some of those slides have already shown up in the classroom.
Right. So, is there a way to use that sort of application of teaching to deal with those concepts in a way that does allow for them to be there? As John McWhorter would say, we don't want them to not be at the table, but they can't be the only seat at the table.
Absolutely. Well, obviously I agree with McWhorter on that. I have some people in my own camp who think, well, there's no good way to teach white supremacy culture. It's an absurdity, so why even keep in the curriculum? I was very critical of a Jewish private school in the area where one of my kids graduated from. And there was a teacher that taught a sort of hybrid curriculum that emerged from the controversy of my open letter and criticism of that school. And what he did is he teed up Ibram X. Kendi and John McWhorter. He said, okay, here's anti-racism and here's its critics. And he did it in a series of discussion formats. And the students loved it. He said they couldn't get enough of it. Actually, and most of them agreed with the critique of anti-racism rather than anti-racism once they heard both sides. But I don't care. Like if they want to, agree with Kendi, that's fine. But at least have the discussion. And I think that's exactly where I'd go, whether that's project-based learning or something else. There's a lot of studies about debate and how debating creates critical thinking skills. And I would tee up a lot of social issues and provide the best possible thinking of both sides. And then, there's in Judaism, there's the famous battle between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. These were two different houses of law within the Jewish tradition, and the story is that ultimately God sided with the house of Hillel. Why? Because not only did Hillel make its own arguments, but it cited the arguments of the house of Shammai in making its own first, before its own arguments and making its own arguments. I would love students to be able to articulate not only whatever MX Kendi thinks and what John McWhorter thinks. And if you agree with one, start by citing the arguments of the other. That's, to me, a rich learning. That's how you develop critical thinking skills. It was interesting. I was in conversation with this very left-wing professor, and we were talking about critical thinking skills. Mm-hmm. And I said, I think the way you get the critical thinking skills is by teeing up opposing arguments and letting people sort of think through them. And she was very adamant that I was wrong about that. And what I realized is when she was talking about critical thinking, it was critical consciousness. It was the idea that I'm going to teach students to see through the morass of power and to see the hidden systems of racism in society. That's what critical consciousness is. That emerges. That's what woke ideology sort of entails, is a critical consciousness that you can see through this. In my view, it's absolutely inimical to critical thinking of objective analysis and argumentation and the like. It's saying, I know the truth and I'm going to help you discover it, and I'm going to be and that's what it's doing. In some ways, it might even be intentional. Like, take over the language of critical thinking and call it critical consciousness and make people think that their kids are actually learning critical thinking when they're learning the exact opposite of that. So I think that it's that kind of opposing views. Someone recently called me accused me of both sidesism, and I thought about it for a second. I said, well, I'd rather both sidesism than one sidesism.
Right.
Of course there's sometimes only one side on certain questions, like, did the Holocaust happen or did slavery happen in America? I mean, we know what the facts are about that. We don't have to debate those historical events.
Right.
Only crackpots and conspiracy theorists and hate mongers do that. But are there differences of opinion about why the Germans did what they did? Sure. Can we expose students to that? Yes. Are there differences of opinion about why Lincoln was willing to enter the war? And yes, there are differences of opinion. We can debate about those things. We don't have to debate about whether slavery happened. And so, again, and oftentimes it's not just two sides. There's multiple sides to it. We should expose students to as many as is reasonable. But I think the idea that somehow both sidesism is the greatest evil, no, one sidism is a much greater evil more often than not.
Right. Yeah, I get accused of the same thing, and I find it to be a sort of, entertaining, again, and not in the most positive way. But it's like, you got to be kidding me, right? And right. one of the I think misunderstandings of somebody who might be a moderate or centrist is that they have no strong opinions and they're not really thinking about these things, but that's not the case. Of course, we're again, as I said earlier, sort of trying to examine both sides and look for what we might value and what we might think is wrong, and then go forward from there. Because it's not a matter of team sports; it's a matter of how do we find what is the best or the truth and that kind of thing. I'm looking at the slides that you sent me. I assume it's okay to talk about these, and if not, let me know. One of them is Let's Get Real About Whiteness, and this is from EdCamp 2022. I don't know if you know what EdCamp is, but EdCamps are typically, teachers will probably be familiar with them, although I've not seen a whole lot of maybe COVID kind of took them out of the rotation, but sort of teacher-led, organic professional development sort of conferences, right? And not necessarily put on by a school, although a school might, and a school district might. And so I don't know if you know how this slide deck, this Let's Get Real, because it shows EdCamp 2022.
Yes,
and
I'll explain that. Yep.
Yeah, was it used in that kind of a setting? And
it was originally, but it was then put up for principals to use to teach to train teachers in the school. So the teacher who sort of, if you will, blew the whistle about this, found it in the materials that were being advocated by the school system as part of the anti-racism audit, so that the principals would start using to train their teachers.
Yeah, and
it was actually, but more than that, by the way, I in the minutes of the discussion about the anti-racism audit, it listed five goals of this new pedagogy that they were going to impart, and one of them was white supremacy culture, which is what that slide deck shows.
Right, and so we've got working assumptions, which I find I'll just use the term problematic because that's the term du jour, right? And I find these to be really different from schools where I've worked that are, there's a school that I've done a fair amount of project-based learning work that's in downtown Chicago. It is, the kids have to walk in certain ways to avoid gangs, and, there's shootings, and it's a very, what anti-racists would say is, this is the target of where we need to find solutions. And they would have, and I've been in the school, I've seen their sort of norms and operating, like they are not the same as these, and they're more classical liberal, which was great to see. And working with the teachers, I saw that. But we've got, everyone has the capacity to learn and grow, and the learning of some cannot come at the expense of others. And of course, some is white, and others are BIPOC, or I don't know what POGM is. Do you know that one? POGM?
POGM.
People of... that's a new one on me. We'll have to look it up.
We'll have to look that one up, yeah.
So number 2, discomfort is a natural and needed part of the learning process. I'm on board. And then we won't center the comfort of folks with racial, gender, and other privilege. So now we've got the intersectionality and who's on top and who's not. And
by the way, whose feelings matter and whose feelings don't matter.
Right. Which is a dynamic that shuts down actual conversation in ways that is authentic and organic, in a way that actually can help you work through some of those things. And then educators and our decisions are usually grounded in good intentions. Well, that's nice to hear. But then, and impact, not intention, is what matters. We've all been socialized into the system. And that's just nonsense.
Yeah, that's problematic. That's nonsense. This is an alternative moral framework that I've started to hear about maybe in 2017, 2018. All of a sudden, I would hear like a principal at my son's school saying, well, it's not the intent, your child's intent that matters. It's the harm that's done. It's the impact that it has. And I think, wait, of course intent matters. It's not the only thing, and we have a hybrid legal and moral system in this country. Yes, it matters if you intended to kill the person, and if you didn't intend, you still might be negligent, but it's not the same crime.
Right.
Yet this is based on the idea that if a marginalized group claims that it's been harmed by your words, that you've hurt them, and therefore you must change your words. You must change your thinking.
Right.
Because you've hurt them, and that's enough to establish that you were in the wrong. And that's obviously a devastating set of ideas. It means that my claim of being hurt or harmed trumps your claim at having a say in the discussion.
Right.
So it's just another layer of sort of authoritarian discourse that they've put on top of the existing authoritarian discourse.
Well, one of the things that I've been thinking about lately, and Jonathan Haidt have been, he and Greg Lukianoff have both been on the podcast, and a big fan of coddling of the American mind. And of course, Jonathan's writing a lot about this social media and screen time, of which I'm sympathetic to. I have 2 daughters, 14 and almost 16. And I do have concerns about how much screen time. I limit their access to social media, but not totally. But so I'm sympathetic to that, but I'm also, what I find to be a little bit odd, and stay with me here, this might feel a little bit long, we see all this sort of pushback, and even Jonathan saying maybe we should regulate it. I'm not terribly convinced of that, but okay, we can have that conversation. But what I don't see in this conversation is the role and responsibility of parents to sort of raise emotionally healthy kids. And I'll take it a step further. One of the things that Jonathan put out was sort of a graph of anxiety in people. So the kids and teens were way up, right? And that's no surprise to anybody. But adults under 50, once you got to age 50, it wasn't an elevated anxiety rates, but it was in adults below 50. And so, as you're probably familiar with Lenore Skenazy and Let Grow and that work, right?
She's a good friend of mine, yes.
Yeah, Lenore is I would call her a friend now. We text back and forth a time or two, and she was on the podcast, and I think she's doing important work. People should look it up. But so this idea... Yeah, so this idea of lawnmower parents, helicopter parents, and how much of them, or how many of them, have this understanding. Somehow they develop this understanding that the world should not be full of entropy and bad things happening, which is certainly not real, right? So if they have that mindset, and therefore they're going to try to clear the way for and sanitize everything for their kids, are they also, sort of operating this under assumption that the world should be sanitized and nobody should feel bad or take that on down the line? And so if that's the case, and I see evidence of it. I certainly don't have that, and I'm over 50. Maybe there's a line in the sand of 50-year-olds, but are they more susceptible to this idea, these ideas that are being put forth by sort of the quote unquote woke folks of, intent doesn't matter, impact matters, and we should sanitize everything. And freedom of speech is, we can't have hate speech, which of course, who's the famous ACLU guy, Mighty Ira. Right? It's a wonderful documentary if people haven't seen that.
It is.
Yeah, so I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah. I think that there's some truth to that. A couple of things that come to mind. One is that I think parenting has always been a collective effort. It's not like we've all individually come up with these philosophies of parenting. We tend to do so in consensus. We like to think as parents, and I have teenage kids and young adult kids, that we somehow are all independently parenting, but we're constantly talking to other parents and so forth. And so when parents basically let their 12-year-olds use Instagram, it makes it very hard to be the parent that doesn't allow their 12-year-old to use Instagram. You're in a constant state of war. Your kids think that feel entitled based on what their friends are able to do. Now, maybe we should be okay with that as parents. We'll be in a constant state of war. But I'm not sure it does that much, because then your kid is watching Instagram when they're at their friend's house. I mean, I don't think you get that much added protection from that. What I think can work, and I've heard Jonathan talk about this, is sort of parenting compacts with the school and others that say, okay, none of us are going to allow our kids to use Instagram until they're at least 14 years old or whatever the magic age is. And so you come to consensus in that way. I think in general we are more likely to treat our kids as fragile beings. I mean, what Lenore talks about, like the helicopter parenting phenomena. I remember it was worse, actually. Let's say when my older son, who's now 26, was a little kid, I was very aware of the helicopter parenting thing in my own neighborhood, and I would let my 5 or 6-year-old walk across the alley and deliver whatever food to the neighbors. And you had all these parents like judging me the entire time, and I were like, what's going on here? Like, this is ridiculous. And they're not even aware of how much their parenting styles differ from how their parents were raising them. So I tried to raise my kids with that sort of attitude. And I do think it makes them more susceptible to arguments. Yeah, you can't harm my kid. My kid can't be subjected to ideas that they don't like, because it'll make them very sad and it's going to make them anxious. And of course, that makes them anxious. In other words, it's the fragility that makes them anxious in some ways. We've stopped teaching like the value of resilience and the culture. And in some ways, we've sort of leaned into anxiety. Right. We've empowered people with the anxious mindset to sort of set policy and set social norms for the rest of society. And I think we've got to push back against that. That that the lowest common denominator should not always rule. And I think that's what we've sort of given into too often, is that the lowest common denominator rules. Well, you don't want to say anything that's going to upset somebody. It goes back to that sort of never wrestle with a pig. You don't want to upset somebody who's going to say, you're making my kids sad, so you just don't do it, and that becomes the new norm. No one has resilience. It's where the culture is based on the most fragile kid or the most fragile parent or the most anxious person. That's the new culture. I think that's what's set in here, and it's certainly more susceptible to sort of ideologues that espouse those views consistent with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, probably should wrap up here soon, but I'm looking at the other slide deck that you sent me, which is about culturally responsive instruction and beyond. And I have had some people on the podcast talking about culturally responsive instruction, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, and you probably don't either, but there are ways in which there's sort of this dogmatic approach, which this slide deck is, I think, evidence of that. And, like one of the slides here, why the narrative that critical race theory makes white kids feel guilty is a lie. And I guess that's a Hetchinger report article that they're asking people to read and then discuss and then use that to inform their work in the statement of values and commitment to racial equity. And number one is I do think there's an issue of people. There are some people, broadly on the right who, they don't want to talk about this. They do have some unease with these issues. They're not aware of some of the issues of race and racism that are still present. And, so I do think it's important to recognize that. But, my question on this, and probably similar to your question, is if I am a teacher in this district and I have questions or looking for some complexity or maybe even totally disagree, am I allowed to teach in this district because this is the statement of values and commitment to racial equity, and obviously white supremacy and these pieces are a part of it. And so that's the issue here, is that we all have to agree? And I don't know. I mean, I suppose there's some argument to be made for it.
Well, this is a confusion of values and viewpoints. Mm-hmm. It's a way of saying our values that we should take care of kids and help them learn means that you must believe X. And so they make this very subtle, not so subtle leap from let's be responsive to kids to the people who are talking about critical race theory makes white kids feel guilty is a lie. And that you must believe that in order to be, quote unquote, aligned with our values. I'm probably not quoting them. But I think that's the problem here. Like, yes, we can be culturally sensitive. We should teach our teachers to be culturally sensitive. And that doesn't mean that they have to agree with you about critical race theory. Right. And that doesn't mean that they have to agree with you that America is a pervasively racist country, or that white supremacy is responsible for all disparity. And so, but that's the sleight of hand that takes place. It's sort of it's like a Trojan horse. You enter through
right
cultural responsive education and you exit through white supremacy culture. And if you look at that deck, by the way, it doesn't end with culturally responsive education. It toward the end, it morphs into white supremacy culture pedagogy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It goes slide CRI reflection. And then all of a sudden it's slide 17, white supremacy culture, and there we go. Break up into groups and show and discuss how or where this shows up for admin, faculty, or students. So again, can you say, well, I don't agree with these things as being indicators of white supremacy culture, or I don't see them. And if that's
then
the
you're
case,
violating violating the values
right.
of the school now, because that viewpoint is now treated as a value.
Right. Yeah. Well, again, I don't know how widespread it is. I'm becoming more convinced that it's becoming more widespread, and certainly in a sort of authoritarian and team sports is continuing to spread, and that's a problem. I don't know. Again, I think, how can I, as sort of one voice in this and as an organization, help schools and teachers? And I have had people reach out to me. I certainly don't have the same kind of audience or reach that somebody like, I listen to Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, they say they get several emails a week, right? I don't get that. But I do have, I talked with the superintendent who's a friend and does work for us, and she's in Arizona, and the legislature is trying to take local control, which is not a conservative value. We've got issues in, somebody in Chicago, the people in California. So I do wonder and we'll continue to sort of brainstorm and think about how we can help educators and school leaders and maybe even outside of that policymakers and the larger public understand this in a way that will allow for moderate voices in this sort of classical liberal inquiry process.
Well, keep it up. I appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thanks, and I appreciate what you're doing. Well, I want to make sure you have time to share your links and all that kind of stuff. We'll put them in the show notes, but I know you have the book and you have the website. Anything else? I think you're on Twitter. Well, I know you're on Twitter. We've been on Twitter back and forth, so now's the time. Yeah,
at David L. Bernstein on Twitter, if you'd like to follow me. I'm always up for a good discussion, as long as you don't start berating me and calling my family.
And I can attest to that. He and I have disagreed on Twitter a time or two, and it's been civil.
Yeah, exactly. I have to go back and look at all those. And see,
right.
In light of our conversation, maybe we were agreeing disagreeably.
Yeah, something like that.
You can find my website, www.jilv.org, Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. You can find me by email at david@jilv.org. And my book is Woke Antisemitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews, and you can find it on Amazon or wherever you buy your books online. So I appreciate the discussion and look forward to seeing, hopefully in a year we could do this again and see where we check in with each other and see whether we think it's sort of this ideology is on the ropes, whether we think it continues to expand and the like.
Yeah, well, there's some people who say that woke has peaked and we're on the other side, the downslope towards a more sensible. I'm not terribly convinced of that either, but yeah, maybe in a.
Can I say something about that
before
we wrap it up? Last word, I promise I won't say anything else. I think two things can be true. That we've hit peak woke society wide. In other words, the ideological environment is beginning to thaw, and that specific institutions, in particular K through 12, but in universities, but others as well, are doubling down on it while they still can. In other words, it's the degree that this gets embedded in institutions, and the leaders of these institutions sort of sign on the dotted line of deference to ideologues, to DEI, to whoever else. I think they are sort of stuck with it for a long, long time, hopefully not forever. And I think that's a lot harder to change. Some institutions, by the way, I would say, sort of embraced an anti-racism, but had sort of core liberal values that were temporarily eclipsed, and I think you can win those back. But a lot of others really went headfirst into anti-racism, and I think they're going to have a hard time getting them back. So anyway, that's my 2 cents for what it's worth.
Well, good 2 cents to end with, and David, I do appreciate the conversation. Thanks again so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you found this conversation to be useful, thought-provoking, or something that's worth commenting on and sharing, please do so with your friends, your social networks, and leave reviews where you listen to your podcasts. It's really helpful for our podcast and hopefully for anybody that you might share with. And of course, please visit us at wegrowteachers.com if you have questions about our professional development, or email me at drew@teachthought.com.